Record. Okie dokie. So hi everyone. Welcome to our virtual event, Race and the Salem Witch Trials. So let's see if the PowerPoint's gonna work. It does. Alrighty, so before we dive in today, we've got a couple of just housekeeping announcements. So just a couple of general things to keep in mind as we go forward. So you will notice that Jill and I are sitting here without masks on, so don't worry, we've been in each other's bubble for pretty much the entire pandemic, so we're very comfortable being near each other without masks on, so don't worry, we are taking proper safety procedures. We're the only ones in the museum right now. So you are going to see as we go on, we are going to turn our camera off. The reason why we're going to do that is it just gives you the full screen to see the PowerPoint, and it's a little bit less distracting for us. But at the end, there will be time for questions, and we'll turn the camera back on when we segue into questions. So our hope is this talk is going to be about 45 minutes with time again for questions at the end, but keep in mind this is a very rich topic, so it's possible we may go a little bit over, but as we're starting early, that gives us some wiggle room. So as you can see, this is being recorded and we are going to post it on YouTube within the next few days. So it will be available if you want to watch it again at some point because it was just that great. Or if someone you know wanted to see it and didn't have the opportunity to log on to see it live. And I've jumped ahead of ourselves. I did our housekeeping announcements without introducing us. So my name is Rachel Christ. I am the Director of Education here at the Salem Witch Museum.
And I'm Jill Christensen. I'm the Assistant Director of Education at the museum.
All right, so we are going to turn the camera off and we are going to jump into the presentation. All right, so today we are going to talk about race and its impact on the Salem witch trials. So one of the most frequent comments we got on our Facebook page after posting this event was confusion over why we're talking about race. So several people noted that they've read many books on this subject or taken a class on the Salem witch trials, and they never once explicitly learned about the impact of race, which is precisely why we felt this would be an interesting topic. So typically, when we talk about historic witch trials, we observe the impact of gender. So while both men and women could be accused of witchcraft, women were by far the most frequently accused and prosecuted for this crime. However, particularly in 1692, it's fascinating and quite important to consider how contemporary conceptions of race impacted the events of that year. So we've long explained the Salem tragedy as an event driven by fear, particularly fear of the other. So the other frequently meant people who made you uncomfortable, such as an aggressive woman or a skeptical man, people who worship differently than you, so those who didn't attend church or of the Anglican faith, or people who looked different than white people of English descent. So the accused were often people who had no one to defend them, such as women, widows, and slaves. In the case of the Salem witch trials, Tituba was not the only slave to be accused. At least two other slaves, whose names were Mary Black and Candy, were also imprisoned for witchcraft. So the majority of this talk will be devoted to Tituba, a fascinating figure in early American history. She was the slave of Reverend Samuel Parris and one of the first people to be accused of witchcraft in 1692. The importance of this accusation and the subsequent actions taken by Tituba cannot be overstated. However, before we dive into our discussion of Tituba, we're going to spend some time talking about the importance of the relations between indigenous peoples and the colonial settlers in the years leading up to the Salem witch trials. So as we just mentioned, witch trials were very much driven by fear. And in 1692, fear of native groups was an ever-present reality for the inhabitants of Essex County. Before we proceed, though, we do want to just take one moment and note our language. So when discussing the ethnicity of Tituba, we'll be referring to her as a woman of color. This is because we really don't know where Tituba is from. It's very likely she was from South America, though some scholars make the argument she was African. Also, because we're incorporating 17th century quotes, you will sometimes hear terms like Negro or Indian. Based on our research, we will also use several terms for native groups, including Indigenous, Native American, and Amerindian. It seems there's no consensus on which one is most appropriate. We'd also like to emphasize that we're coming at this topic from the perspective of historians. So the descriptions and statements we will make throughout this presentation are based on facts, unless otherwise noted. So at the end of the talk, we will give suggestions for additional readings for those interested in hearing the voices and perspectives of experts who have immersed themselves in this subject. And again, we'll have about 15 minutes for a question and answer and open discussion at the end of this presentation. We believe Dave Tamanini, who's the author of the new book, Tituba, Intentional Witch of Salem, will be joining us today. He may jump in at the end to answer questions. So without further ado, let's get started.
The majority of the people involved in the events of 1692, the accused, the accusers, the ministers, the judges, and citizenry, were white, as most were people who had emigrated from England or been born here of English parents. As Rachel mentioned, in colonial New England, there was enormous fear of the other, which by the late 17th century was personified for many by a real and terrible threat, as bloody battles raged between the white colonial settlers and indigenous inhabitants. In the 17th century, Massachusetts Bay Colony residents believed wholeheartedly that the devil was real and witches were his agents on earth. This was something they heard about in church regularly, particularly in the parish of Samuel Parris. Salem Village's Reverend Parris was extreme even for his day. We might call him a fire and brimstone kind of preacher. When reading through the records of the Salem witch trials, one often sees the term the black man used by the afflicted and accused in their examinations and testimonies to describe a figure who tormented them or made them torment others. This reminds us how connected fears of witchcraft were to contemporary racial issues. Historian Mary Beth Norton notes in her excellent book, In the Devil's Snare, the term black man could have been a reference to clothing. That is certainly the case in the testimony given by Tituba. Historian Marilyn Roach, author of Six Women of Salem, has also suggested the term could refer to hair color, as in the case of Reverend George Burroughs. However, of the other 35 people who went on to report this spectral black man, it was only Tituba who explicitly referenced clothing. More likely, according to Norton, this term referenced the complexion of the demonic figure. It's likely no coincidence that 17th century New Englanders referred to this evil presence in terms that hint at racial identifiers. The devil was the perfect place for fears regarding the other to repose. A few times, the tormenting figure was called a tawny man, an even more explicit reference to indigenous groups. By this time, the natives were commonly thought to be agents of the devil, emerging from the surrounding woods to take down the Puritan community. And vice versa for the indigenous people, the white colonists must have represented the devil to them. Cotton Mather, in his account of the possession of Mercy Short, described the devil as, quote, a wretch no taller than an ordinary walking staff. He was not of a Negro, but of a tawny or Indian color. He wore a high-crowned hat with straight hair and had one cloven foot. One of the greatest fears of Essex County residents was an invasion by the natives, especially feared by people who lived on the frontier. While today the frontier means perhaps outer space and the American frontier of the Old West meant the Western United States, the frontier in 1692 was what is today a 45-minute drive away from present-day Salem, towns like Billerica, Haverhill, and Gloucester, or wooded areas that were even closer. Fear of the dark-skinned, tawny Native American was a major concern to New Englanders during this period. There had been ongoing war with the indigenous people of New England for years. During King Philip's War, which lasted from 1675 to 78, 52 English towns were attacked and 30% of the English population was killed. It's important to note a far greater number of natives were killed. They had just as much, if not more, reason to fear the colonists, as the English had arrived, taken their land, brought disease, and began these brutal conflicts. In 1677, Boston's General Court issued an edict that no one in the colony could buy or keep an Indian servant or slave above the age of 12, quote, because they causeth much trouble and fear to the inhabitants where they reside, unquote. Though there was a brief reprieve from fighting, the bloodshed began again in 1688 with a conflict known as King William's War. The fighting lasted until 1697 and thus was happening during the witch trials. There were accelerating reports from towns to the north and west of massacres and captives and destruction as the witch hysteria took hold. In fact, in January of 1692, news reached Salem there had been a devastating raid in York, Maine. Many men from Essex County owned property in what is now Maine, where the Abenaki burned towns and massacred colonists. Norton points out that several of the afflicted girls were actually refugees from these wars. Perhaps they were suffering from a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. The major emphasis of Norton's book is the impact the experience of living through this conflict had, both on survivors and on those who heard their terrible tales, and how this contributed to the Salem events. In 1692, residents of Gloucester, Massachusetts, reported growing concerns that Indigenous warriors were nearby, planning to emerge and strike. These fears merged with concerns regarding the witchcraft crisis as reports grew, describing spectral attacks as well as seemingly imagined natives appearing and disappearing from the forest. In areas that were on the frontier, fears concerning Indigenous groups frequently merged with spectral visions in 1692. To further emphasize the reality and fear that gripped these individuals, here are the stories of two women involved in the Salem trials. One of the first three to be accused of witchcraft in 1692 was Sarah Osborne, an ill woman with some scandal in her past who died in prison before going to trial. She confessed that she, quote, one time in her sleep either saw or dreamed that she saw a thing like an Indian, all black, which did pinch her in the neck and pulled her by the back of the head to the door of the house, unquote. Though she herself was on trial for witchcraft, she reported this vision in hope of indicating that she herself was the subject of spectral attack. Mary Toothacher, wife of accused witch Roger Toothacher, sister of accused witch Martha Carrier, mother of accused witch Margaret Toothacher, who was 9 years old, and accused of witchcraft herself, lived on the frontier in Billerica to the west. According to Marilyn Roach, Mary was always afraid of native attack and had nightmares about it even before the witch accusations got underway. On August 5th, 1695, some years after she was released from prison, an Indian raiding party on horseback arrived in Billerica, and its swift assault killed 15 people, including Mary Toothacher. Her daughter Margaret was taken captive and never seen again. These were fearful times. From the perspective of the colonists, the Indian threat was demonic, and this was a huge influence on the Salem witch trials.
Okay, so let's turn our attention now to a fascinating historical figure, Tituba Indian. So if you've ever read a book, watched a movie, or taken a class on the Salem witch trials, this name should be familiar to you. Tituba was the first person to confess to witchcraft in 1692. So why is Tituba so important? Many others confessed to witchcraft during the Salem trials. Tituba was never executed, and after the trials, she disappears into the pages of history. Race informed the fears brewing in the years before the Salem trials. Tituba, a slave and a woman of color, was at the epicenter of this mostly white event. She was in the house when it all started, caring for the children who were first afflicted. The fact that Tituba was a slave, that she was the other living in the house, cannot be underestimated. The choices she made in the early months of 1692 are central to this story. We know almost nothing about Tituba's life before and after the Salem witch trials, though we will discuss some theories posed by historians later on. As is so often the case for slaves and for people of color in our country, If not for her involvement in these events, Tituba would be all but lost to the pages of history. A few years ago, we attended an event called History Camp, hosted annually in Boston, where we had the privilege to see a gentleman speak who was traveling to various jails teaching about Black history. During this talk, he noted that the stories of minorities are almost always completely obscured in the historical record. He said, quote, "Black history is found in the margins," unquote. Meaning, more often than not, the records of these lives are literally found in brief scribbled notes in the margins of documents. For example, sold, died, escaped, etc. This is exacerbated even more for women, as women of the 17th century were frequently invisible, recorded through the lives of their husbands. So the fact that Tituba, a non-white woman of the 17th century, remains such an important figure in this story, and that books are devoted entirely to her, is unusual, remarkable, and perhaps a testament to her character. So here is what we do know about Tituba and her role in the witchcraft trials. The events that triggered the Salem witch trials began in January of 1692 in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. In 1689, Parris arrived in Salem village as the quarrelsome town's fourth minister in 10 years. In his household was his wife Elizabeth and their 3 children, Thomas, Betty, and Susanna, as well as Abigail Williams, Parris's niece, who is likely orphaned and perhaps working as a servant in the household. There were also 2 enslaved adults living in this home, Tituba and John Indian, and a boy of about 15, described by Parris as, quote, "a young Negro lad," unquote. This boy died due to unknown causes in 1689, as Parris notes in his record book. In the winter months of 1691-92, Betty Parris, age 9, and Abigail Williams, age 11, began to exhibit strange and alarming behavior. They clutched their heads, made animal sounds, fell to the floor, and thoroughly frightened the adults around them. So what was this strange illness? The adults prayed and fasted and tried the traditional home remedies, all to no avail. After a month with no change in their condition, a doctor was summoned, and we believe this was local Dr. William Griggs. And he was the first to suggest the behavior could be the effect of bewitchment. So there's a reason why we scheduled this talk on February 25th, as 329 years ago today, Tituba created a witch cake in the Salem Village parsonage kitchen. This singular event dramatically altered the course of the witch trials, as well as our perception of Tituba. A witch cake was an English counter magic technique used to reveal a witch. The recipe called for rye meal mixed with urine from the afflicted person and a concoction that was then fed to a dog. According to Marilyn Roach, this technique was supposed to cause harm to the offending witch, who might in turn reveal herself. Though folk magic was frowned upon in colonial New England, many continued to use these older traditions. There are 17th century reports of white colonists palm reading, fortune telling, or using certain objects to protect their homes from malevolent forces. Primary sources tell us it was white neighbor Mary Sibley who suggested this counter magic method to John Indian, who passed the information to the family's cook, Tituba. It's important to note that this is the one recorded instance of any magic being performed by Tituba. As witch cakes were an English counter magic practice, and Mary Sibley confessed to suggesting the idea, it's likely Tituba was simply following the orders of a white superior. Over time, Tituba's perception of this event, combined with racial stereotypes, eventually distorted her into a voodoo priestess responsible for using black magic. The cake was made while Samuel Parris was away on church business. When he learned folk magic had been used in his own home, he sternly lectured Mary Sibley. He then publicly admonished her in a sermon in mid-March when he claimed the devil hath been raised by this action, escalating the villagers' fear. So why is this so important? Well, rather than curtailing the hysteria, the witch cake triggered more extreme behavior, which spread to other people. As historian Elaine Breslaw observes, quote, "After the witch cake incident, the girls began to exhibit some of the more bizarre physical symptoms," unquote, and more people came down with the illness. Tituba's involvement made her a clear target. So it's also relevant to note Mary Sibley, a woman who openly admitted to suggesting the use of folk magic, was never accused of witchcraft. Tituba, a slave following instructions, instead shouldered the blame for this incident. Terrified that there was a witch hiding in the community, the afflicted girls were asked who was causing their pain. The girls eventually named 3 women: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Women who did not fit into society: a beggar, an ill woman who had married one of her servants, and a slave. Again, the other, people who were easy to scapegoat. So in response to these accusations, the women were arrested and brought in for questioning. The first examination took place on March 1st. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne both maintained their innocence, asserting they had never made a pact with the devil, and as we already saw in Sarah Osborne's case, alluding to fears she herself had been the target of demonic attack. Tituba was the last to be questioned. In a later account given to contemporary writer Robert Califf after her case was dismissed in 1693, Tituba indicated Samuel Parris may have beaten her before one of her examinations. During this period, men had a legal right to beat slaves and women within, quote, reason. When Tituba was brought before the magistrates, she must have known it was extremely unlikely she would be cleared of all charges. She was a woman of color, a slave, and thus in the Puritans' mind, closely related to the devilish natives. She had participated in folk magic, and she had most likely been beaten by the only person who could potentially stand up for her. Under this extreme pressure, Tituba confessed to witchcraft and stated there were other witches in the colony: the 2 women she had been arrested with and several others she didn't know. This again led to an escalation, what we might call a chain reaction witch hunt. We can make many guesses as to why Tituba confessed. The most likely answer is she knew no one would believe in her innocence, no one would defend her, and the safest course of action was to tell the magistrates what they wanted to hear. This is ultimately the act that saved her life, as she was imprisoned, but because it was thought she had valuable information, she was kept alive in jail for the duration of the trials. On May 9, 1693, Tituba faced the grand jury in Ipswich, the Court of Oyer and Terminer having been disbanded in October of 1692, and her case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Despite this verdict, her jail bills prevented her from being released, as Samuel Parris had evidently refused to pay her fees. At some point in the summer of 1693, an unknown person purchases her from Samuel Parris for the cost of her jail fees, after which she disappears from known records. Samuel Parris and his family stayed in the village until 1697, when they were finally forced to leave. Elizabeth Parris, the wife of Samuel, had died by this time. Samuel moved with his family and remarried, and he died in Sudbury, Massachusetts in February of 1720. We don't know what happens to Tituba's husband, John Indian. He became an afflicted witness during the Salem witch trials, a move that prevented him from being accused himself. Though he remained out of prison during the trials, he was, of course, still condemned to a life of slavery. So now let's talk about what we do not know about Tituba. Again, it's often impossible to determine the lives of details about the lives of slaves. Tituba is a remarkable case, as her testimony during the witch trials gives a small glimpse into her life beyond her designation as an enslaved woman owned by Samuel Parris. In the mid-20th century, entire books began to be published on Tituba as an individual, both fiction and nonfiction, which attempted to fill in the details of her story. In 1964, Tituba of Salem Village, a historical novel for adolescents, was published by Black author Ann Petrie. This work hews closely to the facts of the story. Unfortunately, though, it's currently out of print. The first truly significant book written about Tituba is Caribbean writer Mary Say Condy's award-winning novel, I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. Translated from the French, it won France's prestigious Grand Prix Littérature de la Femme Award in 1986. Condé called, quote, perhaps the most powerful woman's voice in contemporary literature of the Americas, unquote, by Choice magazine, and a, quote, important discovery by the Chicago Tribune, wrote I, Tituba from her dreams, imagining a childhood, an adolescence, and an old age for Tituba. In Condé's hands, Tituba becomes a fully formed woman, independent, sexual, resilient, and with a strong voice. We highly recommend this book, though please note it does have adult content. So there are essentially two major theories regarding Tituba's origins, that she was African or Amerindian. Both theories acknowledge she was likely enslaved, brought to Barbados, and lived there for some time before being purchased by Samuel Parris. We know Tituba was with Samuel Parris in Boston in 1680. We do not know if Parris purchased her in Barbados or after he arrived in New England. 10 years after Mary Say Condé's book, Elaine Breslau's Tituba, Reluctant Witch of Salem was published. It is a must-read for anyone interested in the Salem witch trials. Breslau did an incredible amount of research in Barbados about the slave trade, the native inhabitants of the Caribbean, and the plantation culture of the 17th century. She provides an enormous amount of detail about the life Tituba would have had both before and after enslavement if she was from South America or a Caribbean island. Breslau presents some particularly intriguing pieces of evidence that point towards Tituba as an Amerindian. The crux of this theory is a name found in a 1676 inventory of slaves, the name Tituba. In the mid-1670s, Samuel Parris arrived in Barbados and settled in Bridgetown. At this time, he was working as a merchant and had traveled to Barbados after the death of his father to take over their holdings on the island. A 1676 census shows his household contained two other people, a slave and an apprentice or servant. At the same time, the inventory of a plantation 6 miles away from where Parris lived included a list of slaves who worked on the property, including someone named Tituba. This name is significant as it was quite unusual. Breslau notes that at the very least, the appearance of this name on a Barbados inventory shows there was a likely association between Barbados and the Tituba of Salem village. By focusing on this unusual name, Breslau zeroes in on the possible origins of Tituba. She focuses on an Arawak tribe living in the Tetibatana area of the Amacura River. Today, this is in the northeastern corner of South America, Guyana or Venezuela. So approximately, we think somewhere in this area. Arawak names had regular endings used to indicate gender and number. So a female from this tribe would have been called Tetibetado. Breslau goes on to note that if a Barbados planter heard this unfamiliar word, he may have dropped the ending syllables and called that person Tetibe, with variant spellings Tituba, Tatuba, and Tetaba. Breslau also notes that slaves during this period frequently had something called a racial tag. So for example, John Indian. The name Tetibe as a distinctly Indian name would have been sufficient to identify her as an Arawak without adding a racial tag. During this period, there was growing tension and direct conflict between indigenous people and European settlers in various colonial settlements. This growing tension was articulated by the Barbados Assembly in 1676, who proclaimed there would be no additional importation of Indian slaves and would, quote, send away those already brought to the island, unquote. As such, Barbados planters encouraged those leaving the island to take enslaved Indians with them. Samuel Parris, leaving Barbados around this time, may have been encouraged to bring a slave with him as he left for Boston. Based on this evidence, Breslau takes some educated guesses. So if the woman identified in the 1676 inventory was Tituba, Breslau estimates she would have been between 13 and 18 in 1680, meaning she would have been between 25 and 30 in 1692. It's possible Tituba was the daughter of two Indians who lived in Barbados, but it's more likely she was kidnapped from South America either by the Dutch or English in the 1670s. According to Breslau, the slave population of Barbados was largely African with a small Indian minority. Those of the Arawak tribe, particularly the women, were known to be gentle, cultured, and skilled, and for this reason they were desired for domestic work. So if she was from an Arawak tribe, it's likely Tituba did not have to work in the fields as the African slaves were required, but instead worked under the supervision of a white mistress. So within this role, she would have been instructed in Anglican beliefs, learned English, and dressed like an Englishwoman. Breslau goes on to speculate that this training may have allowed Tituba to blend in when she was brought to New England. She would have dressed and perhaps even spoken like an Englishwoman and would have been familiar with the culture to some degree. So with that argument in mind, let's now turn our attention to an alternative theory. To follow the thread of another historian, let's examine the argument that Tituva is of an African origin. Like Breslau's, this theory is heavily predicated on Tituba's name as the primary clue of life before 1692. In 1996, Peter Charles Hoffer argued Tituba was an African slave, likely from Yoruba land. This term refers to a region in Western Africa, present-day Western Nigeria. So Hoffer breaks down Tituba's name in Yoruba and goes on to say Tituba is a root verb meaning to atone or to apologize. To this point, he argues, quote, "It is possible that some family, needing to show submissiveness, so named a female child as an offering to whoever had to be assuaged. Thus, the name becomes a sign of obedience that reestablishes the harmony of a village or a clan," unquote. He also speculates that perhaps this was a name she gave to herself while in slavery. Titi Yoruba, meaning loosely, quote, "Yoruba is everlasting, I am Yoruba and will remain so," unquote. This is a central component of the theory put forward in Dave Tamanini's new book, Tituba, Intentional Witch of Salem. This work is historical fiction and thus takes some liberties with the supernatural, but is a fantastic attempt to step into the shoes of this historical figure. Tamanini envisions Tituba as a slave kidnapped in Africa and brought to Barbados who lost a teenage child in the witch trials. If Tituba was an enslaved African, it's likely she would have been brought to Barbados, often the first stop for English slaves crossing the Atlantic. Hoffer notes during these travels, slaves from many different cultures were often purposely confined together, as a large presence of any one group meant an increased risk of resistance. Thus, these people were even deprived of a familiar language. Approximately 12% of those confined to these ships died en route. In the 1650s and 60s, the first stop for these ships in Barbados was Bridgetown. This is where Hoffer's theory joins with Breslau's, as he too describes the same 1676 inventory. Hoffer postulates Tituba arrived in Bridgetown and was perhaps sold to the Thompson family. So given these theories, there's one more piece of evidence that's important to consider, and that is the court documents of 1692. These are documents that we know with absolute certainty refer to our Tituba. And as Marilyn Roach points out, all of these documents refer to her as, quote, an Indian woman servant, an Indian woman belonging onto Mr. Samuel Parris of Salem Village, the Indian and Tituba Indian, unquote. So while this reference could be due to her marriage to John Indian, it's important to note that the other slaves accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials, Candy and Mary Black, were both referred to as, quote, Negroes. So as Roach points out, this seems to strongly indicate Tituba was an Amerindian woman. While she may not be the girl referenced in the slave inventory in Barbados, it seems likely that she was from an indigenous tribe located in South America, the Caribbean, or South Florida.
While we will likely never know the majority of Tituba's story, it's fascinating to recognize the importance she holds in these events and how she has impacted the subsequent retellings of this story. Here we circle back to the title of this event, Race in the Salem Witch Trials. The fact that Tituba, a slave and woman of color, was the first person to admit to witchcraft has undeniably altered and distorted subsequent retellings of this story. It can sometimes be helpful to think of history as one long game of telephone. If any of you have ever played this game, you will know it begins with a player who says a sentence, and that sentence is whispered in the ear of the next player, and so on down the line. By the time you get to the end, the sentence has almost always become distorted. The same is true in regard to our public interpretations of history, and is particularly true if we consider the story of the Salem witch trials. Now we're going to shift from 1692 and talk about how modern conceptions of race have impacted the depiction of Tituba over time. As we have just noted, every contemporary document references Tituba as an Indian. One of the first subsequent historical assessments of the Salem witch trials, written by Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson in the 1760s, in a larger work about the history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, describes Tituba as having been, quote, brought into the country from New Spain, unquote, which may have meant the area colonized by the Spanish surrounding the Gulf of Mexico. If Tituba had been African, it seems as though Hutchinson, who lived in Boston 70 years after the witch trials, would have known this and described her as such. We can then see the story taken up 100 years after Hutchinson by Charles Upham. Upham wrote the compendium Salem Witchcraft, which is an important resource and one of the first complete accounts of the Salem witch trials written by a historian. His book was based on the earlier writings of Samuel Drake and Samuel Fowler, which state Tituba and John Indian were probably brought from the West Indies. Quote, they are spoken of as having come from the Spanish West Indies and the adjacent mainlands of Central and South America, unquote. Upham states that several of the afflicted girls gathered together and practiced palmistry and fortune-telling, a claim that is not supported by the record. There is only one statement referencing fortune-telling in Beverly's Reverend Hale's notes that says an unnamed afflicted girl toyed with fortune-telling via the Venus glass or the egg in a glass method. In 1868, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow created a play, Giles Corey of the Salem Farms. In this play, Tituba is depicted as an African witch, a practitioner of Obi, an African system of magic. Here we can see some images from a 1900 edition of Longfellow's works, which gives a clear vision of how Tituba was illustrated. Starting in the 19th century, a period rife with racial tension, Tituba began to evolve into a demonized figure, one who shouldered the blame and practiced a strange and unfamiliar form of magic. In 1949, a major book on the Salem witch trials once again hit the market. Marion Starkey's The Devil in Massachusetts described Tituba as half Carib and half Negro. Starkey began a narrative about Tituba's supposed laziness, languidness, and boredom, and created a fictional account of Tituba teaching Betty and Abigail voodoo. She also claimed the parsonage became a, quote, rendezvous for older girls in the neighborhood, unquote. Let us remember, none of this is confirmed in primary source documents. Starkey also paints Betty as timid and close to Tituba, and Abigail as bold and adventurous, and states that pressure from Paris made the girls accuse Tituba. Notably, she does also include the detail of the witch cake. Starkey writes, quote, it is only fair to add that if Salem Village contained anyone at all who deliberately practiced the black arts, it was she, Tituba, unquote, and states as fact that Tituba was thrashed by her owner until she hit on the story he wanted. She also, perhaps correctly, says Tituba responded to cues from the powerful white men questioning her and told them what they wanted to hear, and as such, she laid down a pattern for those who followed. Notably, Starkey writes that, quote, I have invented the scenes with Tituba, but they are what I really believe happened, unquote. Looking back and comparing this text with the primary source documents, this is a shocking departure from the historical record. Now, 250 years after the fact, Tituba had fully transformed from an Indian woman asked to make a witch cake into a practitioner of the black arts responsible for triggering the events of 1692. From here, there is, of course, Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. While this work was never intended to be an accurate historical text, Arthur Miller certainly took dramatic liberties with the story. Drawing heavily from Starkey, Miller's 1953 play vividly presented Tituba as a black slave responsible for leading a circle of girls in demonic rituals in the woods. Again, by the mid-20th century, there was now a persuasive depiction of Tituba as the cause of the entire tragedy, an intentional practitioner of foreign magic who influenced young, frightened, and impressionable children. It's in the 1960s that historians finally began to reconsider the possibility of Tituba being an Amerindian woman. However, these depictions continued to include hints of racial prejudice, as they still affiliated her with the Black arts. In 1969, Chadwick Hansen joined the historical debate with his unique text, Witchcraft at Salem. Hansen argued the Salem trials were based in real witchcraft, as he believed there was sufficient evidence to argue individuals in Salem were practicing magic, and thus there was true cause for concern. For Hansen, Tituba was not Black, but a Carib Indian. He also says, quote, although the egg and glass was an English rather than an Indian method of divining, she may well have been involved from the beginning, unquote. He claimed her confession meant she likely had previous knowledge of the occult and also experienced hysterical hallucinations. For Hansen, her confession led the way for people believing there was an organized society of witches. Stephen Boyer and Paul Nissenbaum described Tituba and John Indian as a West Indian slave couple in their groundbreaking 1974 work, Salem Possessed. They note that Tituba morphed from Indian to African due to embellishment and racial bias. From here, Marisé Condé, Elaine Bresslaw, Charles Peter Hoffer, and later Marilyn Roach enter the story. As we have seen, it is in the 1990s that there is a concerted effort to untangle the various depictions of Tituba. It's at this point that historians began to return to the primary sources and made arguments based on what we know to be fact. Marilyn Roach aptly describes this transformation. Quote, as generations passed, Tituba would be referred to in print as a half-breed, half Indian and half African, then as African or Negro, dismissed in either case as an ignorant savage practicing pagan rites, even though the only magic she certainly participated in was the English witch cake charm at the suggestion of a white neighbor, unquote. Tituba remains a fascinating historical figure to this day, and while there are considerable efforts to untangle her history, she continues to be distorted in popular culture. In some cases, this is based on older scholarship and writings. Our museum still includes traces of the Marion Starkey argument that Tituba was leading the circle of afflicted girls. Our museum was created in 1972, a time when this was still a dominant thread in scholarship. Please note, we are actively working to update our entire museum to bring it in line with contemporary scholarship. Unfortunately, COVID has had a huge impact on our plans, as it has for so many museums, but we do plan to move forward with this update and are particularly excited about reinterpreting Tituba's role in this story. The Crucible has also had a major impact on the way we remember this story today. Working with student groups, we can say from firsthand experience, and perhaps many of you have experienced this as well, for many, reading The Crucible is often the only exposure students have to the story of the Salem witch trials. For this reason, the depiction of Tituba as an evil voodoo practitioner who led a magic circle strongly lingers in our cultural memory. Even in television shows today, like the TV series Salem, Tituba has been portrayed as a malevolent and powerful witch.
So before we end today's talk, we want to say how much we've come to respect and admire this historical figure and are intrigued with the imagined life she led after the trials. So Elaine Bresslaw puts forth the theory that Tituba and John Indian were sold together, but their child, a daughter named Violet, remained in the Paris household. So there's no proof they had a child, but it is an interesting argument. Marisé Condé imagines a bittersweet ending for Tituba. In this version, John Indian ends up in a wealthy white household in Topsfield, Massachusetts, while Tituba returns to her beloved Barbados. Though she's ultimately hanged in this version, Condé writes of her afterlife as a spiritual leader who guides those who fight against oppression. Dave Tamanini imagines Tituba being purchased by a sympathetic owner who offers her an indentured servitude with the opportunity for freedom after 10 years. He too imagines she is separated from John, though he suggests John perhaps made a break for freedom. Though far from this event, it's remarkable that Tituba may be the most famous figure from the Salem witch trials. Over the past few weeks as we've worked on this presentation, we've noticed her name appearing in popular culture. For example, she's mentioned in both American Horror Story and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. It's heartening that Tituba continues to intrigue us today. This has been a fascinating subject to research. The big takeaway here is how much pain and sorrow follows when giving in to fear of the other. We hope this presentation has introduced you to a different viewpoint and perhaps inspires you to learn more. So we hope you enjoyed the presentation. We will continue doing virtual lectures in the future. Please let us know if there are any topics you want us to cover. On the screen right now is a list of books we referenced today. You can find them on our online store and also at your local bookstores or libraries. So with that, we're going to dive into some questions and answers. And Dave, if you are here, can you just say so in the chat so we know you're here? And we can turn our camera back on. Hello. So it looks like there's 2 questions right now. Do you know Alice Lake's maiden name?
So I don't know.
I don't know who Alice Lake is. I'm sorry. She was hanged in Massachusetts. We're not familiar with her. I'm sorry.
And yes, at the beginning of the lecture, we mentioned the name Mary Black. Yes, she was a Black woman. So there's one of those racial tags.
So does anybody have any questions or just comments about the talk today?
Here's somebody booted out.
Oh.
Well, Darcy, you'll be able to see it on YouTube shortly.
It must be because it looks like we're down to 93 participants, so you probably got pushed out. I'm sorry, but you'll get to see the whole thing. It's recorded. Do we know anything more about Candy or Mary Black?
No, not that I can say right off the top of my head. They are very briefly in the records.
And again, it kind of goes to show in regards to slaves, unless you were brought into court for something, it's really hard to know any details about their lives.
Yeah, and we don't know any connection to any other person. So
yeah.
And again, Will Black, the slave from Maine, may again have been a racial tag to identify his race.
Oh, thank you from a fellow museum educator. Sending you lots of luck as well.
Will Black was from Pepperell, was a slave for Pepperell. Oh, in York, that's interesting.
Some secondary sources mentioned a male slave of Nathaniel Dane being accused in Andover, but I found no primary source reference to him in my research. Interesting.
Yeah, so I don't know that one. I've done some Andover, North Andover research and don't know that information. Lester Randall, Kickapoo Tribe in Kansas, chairman.
Oh,
yay.
Nice. Yes, so we don't think Tituba practiced voodoo in any way. It doesn't make sense. So Breslaw goes into a pretty elaborate argument in her book about if she is from an Arawak tribe or had been living in Barbados for some amount of time, the kind of religion she would have practiced, and there is this kind of idea of magic in that religion. So if you're interested in that, absolutely read Breslaw's work. She has some incredible details there. So it gives you a little bit more sense of if she's from that area, this is what she would have been familiar with at least. Will you have a link? A link to what specifically?
To this tour?
To the
yeah, there'll be
event.
There'll be a link on YouTube, or we'll
we're gonna
share it.
We're gonna post it on YouTube, and then I'll share it on the Facebook group for those who couldn't come today. Is Salem open? Yes, we are open. We're shifting into phase 3, part 2, I think. It was just announced, so we are open for in-person tours, and everybody's been doing a really good job with COVID protocols in Salem, which has been really nice to see.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
oh, Richard
Yeah.
talking about the Andover,
Yes.
right. Richard Height is on here, and he's written a wonderful book called In the Shadow of Salem about the Andover witch hunt.
Which is also a must read if you're interested in the Salem witch trials. So we don't have a YouTube tour. We do have an online sites tour that is free and on our website, which Jill has spent years now developing and is really impressive. We also have a recorded tour of our neighborhood. That's like a virtual walking tour, and that you can find through our Facebook page right now. Thank you for all these thank yous.
There's Marilyn.
We did not talk about Quakers specifically, but at the beginning we had said, people who are considered the other are people who don't practice the dominant religion. So Quakers absolutely fell into that category, unfortunately.
And in fact, where this museum is, back in the 17th century, the elder minister of Salem lived on this property. And he, in his early days, was quite anti-Quaker, but as he got older, he moderated a little bit.
Yeah.
But the Quakers were not treated well at all.
No, not
in
at all.
Massachusetts.
Yeah. Oh, a descendant of Rebecca Nurse.
Yay, we love Rebecca.
Oh, you're doing a paper on the museum. Well, I hope this helps. Lots of thank yous. Thank you for coming. This was a really wonderful turnout. We were not expecting, or we didn't know what to expect.
I'm from Prince Edward Island.
Oh, you visited in the 70s.
Oh, and a museum person.
Nice.
Fantastic. Great oysters from Prince Edward Island. The other will stick with me forever. That's nice.
Good. So based on the presentation we have now, as we just mentioned towards the end of the talk, our presentation has some dated information about Tituba, which we are very aware of and are working on updating. We are planning on updating the entire museum. COVID has hindered those plans, as it has for most museums, unfortunately, but we're hoping to have those renovations done within the next couple of years. So we are going to focus on Tituba just in a more, in a way that's in line with contemporary scholarship. So as we mentioned, we still have that older thread of scholarship that treats her as, running this circle of girls teaching them magic. And we know now that that is not supported by primary source documents. So we're really excited to correct that inaccuracy.
Sabrina.
Oh, Sabrina. She's a descendant of Susanna
We
Martin.
love Susanna Martin, too. To find evidence of Tituba in the shop.
Oh,
so,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I do want to say that we just brought into our bookstore, which we're very proud of our bookstore. I think it's the best in town. The 3 Tituba books here, Mary Seconde's, Elaine Breslaw, and Dave Tamanini's. We always have Marilyn's books. So at least we have some reading if you come here and are looking for information about Tituba, and they're available on the website as well. Just out in Salem.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I don't know what other places do about Tituba, to be honest.
Oh, I see. So there's a difference between an indentured servant and a slave. An indentured servant is someone who's working as your servant for a certain period of time. They've signed a contract with you, and they will be released from that contract after they've fulfilled a certain period.
And generally, indentured servants were, say, Irish people who were brought here, and it was to pay their passage. It was to get them over here. They would work off the money that was paid to bring them to America.
But the difference is a slave is someone who is enslaved for their entire life. There's no, chance at being free. And as we've talked about, you're frequently kidnapped and forced to be a slave, or you're born into a life of slavery. Were the superstitious beliefs that perpetrated the trials in the mainstream in Massachusetts Bay Colony? So, I mean, yes.
Everybody.
Yeah, everybody believes in witches. Everybody believes in the supernatural. They believed in what was called the invisible world. So that's around you all the time. And they also believe in folk magic. So you're not supposed to do folk magic. You're not supposed to do things like making witch cakes or reading your palm. But people are doing it, you know, kind of on the fly. But because this is this heightened environment where they're worried about witchcraft and there's this mysterious illness and tensions building, it triggers the witch trials when the witch cake is made, or at least it's one of the big contributing factors. Oh, I think this is the continuous, or the superstitious beliefs isolated to individual communities. So no.
Nope.
They
were everywhere. Oh, I like that. Don't open an umbrella in the house or the witches will come out.
I got in trouble for that name. All right, so there's time for a few more questions. If anybody has a final question, it's been really wonderful to meet all of you. Do you think that Salem is haunted by the witches who died there? I don't, and I know that people in Salem will tell you different things about whether or not there are places that are haunted and so on, but, you know, I think that I don't necessarily believe in ghosts. Joe, I don't think
yeah,
you do either.
you know, we haven't had any, you know, evidence of such a thing, but we do try to keep the memory of these innocent people alive.
Yeah.
So in that way.
There will be a replay of this. It's going to be posted on YouTube probably tomorrow or the next day. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We hope you have a great rest of your night, and everyone stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.